Good evening, everyone. Thank you, and welcome to Science on Tap. My name is Susan Knight. I work up at UW Trout Lake Station, not far from here. And thank you for coming to our program tonight. We have a number of sponsors of our program. We have UW Trout Lake Station, UW Kemp Natural Resources Station, Minocqua Public Library, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and of course our host, the Minocqua Brewing Company. So thanks to everyone. Before we get started, I've received a word of a march and rally in support of the Earth in honor of Earth Day, and kind of in collaboration with the March for Science on April 22nd. Anybody interested in participating in that, there are some brochures going out the door. So feel free to take one of those brochures. So anyway, thanks for coming. Remember, Science on Tap is an example of the Wisconsin idea where the borders of the university are the borders of the state. And we set up an opportunity for you to hear an interesting speaker and not to have a lecture, but to get a chance to ask your own questions. And I'll remind you that there are 4 ways to watch. Of course, you can come and watch right here, as you all are now. We also have live streaming at the library if you don't want to stand up. If we got a big crowd tonight, which is really fantastic to see. But we are live streaming over at the Minocqua Public Library. And also, we're live streaming for anybody, so you can watch at home as long as you've got a fast enough internet connection. Not always the case around here, but you can. And you can watch any event later. We video all of our programs, the entirety, and then those are archived. And then as well, we make a 5 to 10 minute short version with a few minutes of the speaker speaking and then a few minutes of question and answer in each one. So I hope you'll check those out on our website. Just Google Science on Tap Minocqua and you'll get to it pretty quickly. Our next Science on Tap, next in May 3rd, our topic will be gardening in northern Wisconsin. And that will be Jason Fischbach, who is a gardener not from the Madison area, so not southern Wisconsin, but up around here. And he'll be able to talk about fruit trees and all kinds of gardening issues. So come with your questions about gardening. But tonight we are thrilled to have Dr. Scott Craven. It's a huge honor for us to have him, Professor Emeritus of the UW-Madison Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology. Scott Craven is a wildlife ecologist and wildlife specialist. And from a young age, Scott's hero was Aldo Leopold, I'm sure familiar to all of you, the father of wildlife ecology. And Leopold is the reason that Scott became a wildlife ecologist. Scott was originally from New Hampshire, earned a degree in zoology there at the University of New Hampshire. And he moved to Madison in 1972 to attend graduate school. And he became a professor in 1979 at the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, and after earning his doctorate degree. He joined, and so in addition to teaching and advising students and conducting research and serving as department chair, he was also a wildlife ecology specialist for UW Extension. And he retired from teaching about 5 years ago, but he continues to work with specific extension programs, and he is, as I'm sure all of you know him, as a monthly guest on the Larry Meiller Show on Wisconsin Public Radio. So tonight, Scott will discuss the future of hunting, including its importance in the North Woods, and this will be especially interesting after hearing about chronic wasting disease from Mike Samuel last month. And he'll also entertain your questions about any kind of wildlife in the state, updates for key game species. All right, so as I told you, we have a little trivia question. This guy is a real storyteller, so you get him going, and I think we'll have a great time tonight. So before he came to Wisconsin, as I said, Scott was teaching high school in New Hampshire. To get the students excited about taking biology, he had a couple of boa constrictors. And to get them really excited, he would feed them rats. And so it got the kids kind of excited about biology. Well, at the end of the school year, one of the snakes had disappeared. The big snake had disappeared. They looked everywhere, high and low, and they could not find it. So the snake finally reappeared in the fall. Where had it been? All right, so here's the Multiple choice. A, in one of the marching band's tubas, where it slithered out of the band as the band practiced for its first big football game. Or B, in one of the home ec ovens, where the teacher found it when she was reminding the students to check the oven before you turn it on. Or C, in one of the school buses, where it slithered down the brake pedal as the bus driver was driving the kids on a field trip. What's the vote?
It was C.
Scott Craven.
I was behind the school bus driving as we were headed to the coast for a marine field trip, and all of a sudden the bus went in the ditch. Kids piled out the windows and doors, screaming and shrieking, and by the time I stopped and got up to the door, kids were all out, but the bus driver was just kind of quivering in her seat, and I got her out of the bus, and all she could say was, what's she saying? The kid said, snake, she yelled. Anyway, as she was driving along, the boa constrictor was spiraling down the brake pedal onto her foot. And she didn't think much of that. And actually, she quit on Monday. That was on a Friday. She quit and resigned on Monday. And it turned out to be the missing boa constrictor that had apparently been released on the bus as a prank in the spring. And it was on that bus for 3 months, all summer while it was parked in the bus yard. No food, no water, but it was still alive. Good lesson in how those reptiles can survive for long periods. It was much skinnier than it was when I was feeding it, but I recovered the snake. So, no missing children. Actually, one of the things I thought I might do tonight, after I was asked about a humorous anecdote to begin this with, I thought, after I told you about the snake on the bus, I said, oh no, the alligator hunt in Florida from 2 years ago was a much better story, but we'll leave that till the end of the program, and if anybody's still hanging on, I think you'll find the experience of my son and I hunting with 2 guides in central Florida in the middle of the night for a large alligator. When one of the guides, well, I'll just give you a little teaser here. So we arrived at the guide's house, and I thought his name was Tom. It turned out it was Scott. My son's name is Jeff, so it's Scott and Jeff. And then when we got there, he said, oh, yeah, I couldn't get my regular assistant tonight. I got Jeff helping us out. My son elbowed me. He said, isn't that kind of odd, Scott and Jeff? I said, it's just a coincidence. He said, I don't know. The guide said, I don't know where Jeff is right now. And, oh, wait, here he comes around the shed. And this guy came around the corner of the shed in kind of greasy camos and a T-shirt and a beanie pulled over his head. And it was quite obvious that he'd been in some sort of an accident. We never found out what. We're afraid to ask. But he had a rather dramatic scar across his face, and one eye was missing, which, unfortunate situation, and we kind of clammed up about it. But the odd part of it was that over the missing eye was a tanned alligator skin patch, and embedded in the middle of it was a green glass alligator eye. And then my son elbowed me and he said, what the heck have you gotten us into? And it got a lot worse over the course of the next 10 hours. But we'll come back to that later if anybody's still standing. Okay, well, it's always a pleasure to be up here in this area. My wife and I have a place just across the county line in northeastern Price County on a small lake there, and we've spent a lot of time in the Minocqua area. When I first came up here, I think it would have been in the early 1970s. As soon as I got into town, I said, oh my gosh, this is just like northern New England. And it was just like being home again. And I really fell in love with the Kemp Natural Resources Station on Lake Tom. Ended up serving there for 2 years at different times as interim superintendent of the station. So I have a long history in this area and lots of friends, some of whom have come up and reacquainted themselves tonight. So it's always nice to be up here. In terms of what we will talk about tonight, I may change things up a little bit. First of all, I should say it's very nice to not have to worry about whether the PowerPoint projector is working or not. So that's a nice start. There were 2 things I wanted to accomplish. One was to talk a little bit about the state of wildlife in Wisconsin, in terms of what was doing well and maybe what was not doing so well. My contention, to be a little on the cheerful side, is that most of our wildlife resources are really doing remarkably well. There are still a few bumps in the road, but many populations are at all-time historical highs right now. So there's a lot of good news. Whether our agencies will be able to continue to take care of them, given some of the issues that are going on, is another matter that maybe you may want to question me a bit on, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So one issue is talking a little bit about wildlife populations, how they were doing, and what the future held there. And the other was to start out with what I had planned to deal with, which was the imminent release of the 2016 United States Fish and Wildlife Survey on hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation in the United States. Fish and Wildlife Service conducts this survey of the American public by telephone every 5 years. And the magic number, of course, there's a tremendous amount of information gleaned from this huge survey, but the magic number that most of the people in my business wait for is, okay, how many hunters were there in the United States? And for about the last 3 decades, up until 2011, which was the last one, that number had been ratcheting slowly down. So the trend was down. And this has caused tremendous consternation among natural resource managers, for whom hunters represent the major funding string for conservation. I'm sure most of you are aware of things like the Pittman-Robertson Act, the 11% excise tax, that anyone who buys a firearm or ammunition or anything like that, it's collected by the federal government and then distributed back to the states based on the number of hunting licenses they sell. And it's just, for the last 8 years, it has just skyrocketed in the amount of money generated for conservation, not necessarily because of hunting, but because, as you know, there was great fear under the previous national administration that guns were going to be under a lot of pressure, and people being people, they were stockpiling guns and ammunition, and all this tax money was being collected, and millions of dollars were flowing. Wisconsin and Texas are the 2 main beneficiaries, so Wisconsin was getting millions of dollars out of this fund, and that all goes to fund wildlife research, shooting ranges, hunter education, and that kind of thing. So it was a big deal. So as this number began to decline, there were lots of reasons why resource managers were panic-stricken about that. And the result of that constant decline has been almost like a religious crusade amongst many state agencies in an attempt to recruit more hunters and to do just about anything they could think of creatively, whether it was reducing the prices of licenses or offering programs for kids or special hunts or all sorts of tactics which have collectively been which collectively fall under a term now that the professionals use called R3, recruitment, retention, and reactivation. R3. Try and get new hunters, try and reactivate people who have quit, and try and keep people engaged. And it really has been a very aggressive program in many states, including here in Wisconsin. And there are lots of good reasons for it. There are just a couple things I wanted to get people thinking about a little bit that make me a little nervous about the whole situation. So we'll try and do that too. And if that doesn't resonate with this particular group, we'll head more towards the wildlife population end of things. And then you can go in any direction you want with the questions. After 30 years on the radio with Larry, we long ago learned that it doesn't really make any difference whatsoever what Larry or I think or want to talk about. When the first caller says, "There's a skunk under my porch," then all anybody wants to do is either, "I've got one too," or "What do I do when I get sprayed?" And that's the end of the program. So we'll see how that plays out. And finally, I guess there were just a couple things that, for fear of omitting them later, there were just some little morsels I wanted to make sure that you left with, realizing that there are some opportunities coming up that some of you might want to avail yourselves of. For example, this coming Monday, April 10th, that Monday night in April every year are the spring hearings for the Conservation Congress. And they are held in every county in the state. on that Monday night, so 7 o'clock next Monday, every county, and it's easy to find out where they're held, usually in a high school gym or something like that. Every citizen is welcome to go to the Congress hearings and voice their opinions on the advisory questions which are being put to a vote, which ultimately that information feeds back to the Natural Resources Board, and some of these things become regulations or laws that bind what we do for hunting, fishing, and other such activities. Attendance at these hearings has dwindled over the last few years, 5,000 or 6,000 total people, I think, attending in the state, which is unfortunate. It got the reputation that it was just a bunch of hunters arguing about this, that, or the other thing. But there are actually some questions that have general interest. The last massive hearing was 9 or 10 years ago. You know what question brought out more people than ever at these hearings? Dove hunting, yes. We're going to hunt the bird of peace in Wisconsin. I think attendance around the state was pushing 50 or 60,000 for that question, and it was going to be the end of civilization as we knew it, and people really got out and voiced their opinions. But they went ahead and opened up a dove hunting season, and now it opens on September 1st every year without incident and without any noticeable effect on the doves. It didn't make any difference. In fact, post facto, I would argue that it was actually good for the doves because people began to pay some attention to them. Farmers planted sunflower fields for the doves and for hunting purposes. It proved to be a tempest in a teapot. There's another one coming up Monday night that I'm a little curious about whether that will attract more attention. Question number 80 on the ballot on Monday night deals with whether we should be hunting sandhill cranes. I'm only the messenger here. So if you have some feelings about that, cranes are hunted in quite a few states, including some south of us who hunt the cranes that are produced here in Wisconsin. So anyway, that will be on the docket. Of course, I thought that we'd never have a dove season either in Wisconsin, but we do. Now, I don't know about the cranes, but with the presence of the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, I don't know how that'll play out. But that's only one of 80-some questions that are on the docket. So that's coming up on Monday night. A couple days later, on the 13th, the comment period closes for the, if I asked you what a CDAC was, could anybody tell me? The County Deer Advisory Committees. One of the things put in place by the infamous Dr. Deer report of 3 or 4 years ago. But they seem to be working out okay for the most part. But their recommendations, each county's recommendation for antlerless deer harvest and other things dealing with deer management were ironed out at the March meetings, and they're now up and available on the DNR website for public comment up until the 13th. So if you feel strongly about any aspect of what they're recommending, then you can go online and check that out. And while you're there, if you're interested in deer, there's a new sub-site on the DNR website called Deer Metrics, that if you're interested in deer in terms of, hey, how many are there, how many were harvested, where is this, where is that, all those data points are presented on that Deer Metrics website. If you think back 5 or 10 years, all this stuff was talked about in the papers. Leading up to the November deer season, the DNR folks were making predictions. How many deer are there? How many will be harvested? Everybody, how many are in such and such a county? Everybody was all snarled up in the numbers. And it was kind of interesting at that particular time of year, but all that, again, went by the boards with the Kroll Deer Report, but you can still access the information if you want it on this Deer Metrics site. And then, of course, in another 2 weeks, I think the 19th is the opening day of the spring turkey season, our only spring hunt. And for people who are interested in that, that's become a big deal in Wisconsin as well. And there are lots of turkeys. Although I'd be curious about your observations just driving around to and from town, Price County, since those same winters that knocked our deer herd back, I don't see nearly the flocks of turkeys that I saw along the highway that I was seeing 3 or 4 years ago. Any general feeling that there aren't quite as many? They're up. And where exactly do you live? I just, I don't have a permit for this area, and in fact, I was so tied up on December 10th with bear issues that I forgot to apply at all, so I have no turkey permit. But anyway, so those are a couple things coming up in the spring that might be of interest to you. The other one I wanted to mention is Oneida County's been added to the DNR's Snapshot project, the big project using trail cameras, empowering individuals, landowners, or whatever. Cameras will be issued to them. They are installed or deployed as part of the project, and then the landowner's responsibility is to turn in the data cards and so forth. This will eventually be a statewide effort to collect information on wildlife abundance and distribution that these trail cameras are just very good at. If you don't have a trail camera and put one out on your own, you'll be amazed at what's creeping around out there at night. Your neighbors and all sorts of other stuff. But anyway, that's another opportunity that's just coming online in this area. So we can talk about some of those things as well. Okay. Let me just, we'll see if we come back to this notion of on the number of hunters situation. I didn't offer the closure. So in 2011, when this survey information came out, after years and years of decline, all of a sudden the data were released. I was at a meeting in Chicago for a national hunting awareness class that I run around teaching. We were all sitting there on the advisory committee, and one of the guys who works in Washington yelled, "Oh, the hunter data has been released." And he said, I said, "What's the number?" He said, "Hunter numbers are up 9% to 13.7 million. And I thought there'd be joyous celebration in the group, everybody patting themselves on the back for a job well done. First thing out of his mouth, "It must be a mistake." I said, "Wait, what's going on here? Why the negative attitude?" But so many of these programs were built on the notion that we were sliding into the abyss, that an uptick was viewed as some sort of a problem. And as it turned out, there were a couple of states that had botched their data sets, and part of it was in error. But there was, in fact, an increase. And now everybody's anxious. Since one data point doesn't make for much of a trend, everybody's uptight now about what was supposed to be released April 1st, which is what I was going to talk about, in terms of the data now for 2016. But now we hear, no, they've delayed that until July and maybe even December. So I don't know what will happen. But the notion of 13.7 million hunters in the United States, a lot of people hang their hat on that number, but that's not a true representation of what's out there because of something called the churn rate, which is part of that data set. I find it hard to comprehend. I've had a hunting license since I was 16 in New Hampshire. I can't imagine a year going by without having a hunting license, even if I wasn't hunting. Yet, the problem is when you look at the data set, they call people on the phone. Did you hunt last year? Yes or no? 13.7 million people said yes the last time around. Well, that's the extrapolation. They didn't call that many. But what happens is when you look at the information, over a 5-year period, about 25% of the people involved only hold a hunting license once every 5 years. Another 15% or so once every 3 years, and it's a relatively small percentage, approaching about 20% to a quarter, who have a license every year. So the way the survey is taken, they miss the people who are in an off year. If you do a little mathematics and add those people in, they're hunters, they just don't have a license in that year, the number is actually a lot closer to 30 million than 13. Which is a much more reasonable percentage of the American public, and therefore maybe less room for concern. But the problem is that also conveys the idea that all hunters are not the absolute rabid conservationists that we'd maybe like to think of. Because if you only hunt once every 3 or 4 or 5 years, I think must be a difference in attitude there between someone who's out there every year tromping around in our fields and forests. At least that's the way it is for me. In Wisconsin, the concern this past year, our bellwether for a number of hunters is how many deer hunting licenses are sold. And this year it dropped by, I think it was either 12 or 14,000. There could be a whole host of reasons for that. It could be a one-year aberration. It could be the fact that the northern herd has been in poor shape for the last few years and people may have thrown in the towel. A month ago you heard from Mike Samuel about chronic wasting disease. From my standpoint, CWD was discovered 6 miles from our farm. We've killed 17 CWD positive deer on the farm. My son and I have accounted for 5 of them. You only do that for so long, taking a deer home, cutting it up, putting it in the freezer, only to get a call from the warden 2 or 3 or 4 weeks later saying, oh, did you shoot deer 45721? Yes, I did. It was diseased. Throw it away. Into the freezer, into a bag, whomp, off to the landfill. That is a very discouraging and depressing situation. So our deer camp on that farm, which I'd been a part of for 30-some years, it took only 2 years, and the deer camp was gone. There were 12 of us. My son and I were the only 2 left. And if he couldn't get there from Los Angeles, I found myself on the farm alone. A bad situation. So I know Mike is very good and has worked a long time with the science behind CWD, so I expect if you were here for that, you understand that a little better. But the human element is often lost in the translation, and the destruction of deer camps and things like that, incredible. But some of those people among the 12 just quit hunting. So some of that goes into why this decline has occurred. Anyway, some of the things that concern me, I'll just throw out one because I brought this along. I was going to pass this around, but I don't think I will. There's a picture here in the upper part of this brochure. It advertises a land management, land conservation company, I think from Indiana. Doesn't really matter. The caption of the picture is Cody, age 5, with his 180-point white-tailed buck. That bothers me a little bit. I don't know whether it bothers other people who understand this kind of thing, but I find it hard to imagine that a child who is barely in kindergarten, first of all, can handle a high-powered rifle like the one across that buck's antlers, or can appreciate the fact that if this was all above board and so forth, that's likely the biggest deer at age 5 that kid will ever see or kill, even if he hunts until he's 85. I'm not a child psychologist, but I think there's something screwy going on here. So one of my concerns about some of this frenzy over recruitment, retention, and so forth is working with some of the really younger kids. It just seems like there are all sorts of problematic issues there. So we can talk about that later if you want. Okay, back quickly here, time-wise, what are we doing? We need to get to questions pretty quick. All right, on the general wildlife front, just a couple of things to throw out. I'll avoid deer for now. If you want to talk about deer, I'm happy to do it, but the deer situation is kind of a mess. People are still sort of unhappy about some of the changes that went into effect because of the Kroll report. People in the Northwoods are unhappy with deer numbers. They're suspicious of the fact that presumably the harvest went up pretty dramatically this past fall, even though all the measures that people use, like, gee, we only had 3 entries in the big buck contest in such and such a town or whatever, just didn't seem to mesh up very well. We can talk about that stuff a little bit. On other fronts that are more positive, the eagles were back on our lake this morning flying around. You know, there's a bird, most of us can remember 30 years ago when all the restaurants up here had placemats that were talking about the peril of the loons. The eagles were disappearing. What are we going to do? Got to do this, got to do that. Now all of a sudden, you know, these birds have both become quite plentiful and secure. Eagles have been removed from the endangered species list. I think last year the count was 1,502 pairs of nesting eagles in Wisconsin, 1,500, and now in 70 of our 72 counties, there are nesting eagles. The only 2 counties, I think, are Milwaukee and Walworth, and they'll get eagles sooner or later. So that's pretty amazing. From a bird that was, oh, we're going to lose them all between DDT and other problems, and now they're virtually everywhere in the state. Pretty neat deal. So there are certainly some birds and success stories like that. I think everybody knows the story of the bear population and how well they've been doing. And I guess I was trying to think of species that are meaningful to folks up here. Grouse are very popular for a lot of reasons, and the good news there is this is a strange bird in that they follow this 10-year cycle of abundance that most people have at least a cursory understanding of. So the real deal is, where are we on the cycle? The good news is we're on the upslope, and we're maybe 2 years in, so there'll be more grouse hopefully this year if the spring cooperates. There'll be more the year after, and quite a few more the year after that, and all of a sudden there'll be a whole mess of them. And then we'll slide down the slope for 5 years into the bottom of the cycle. It'll take a while for them to come back. But when we're on the upswing, northern Wisconsin is a destination for bird hunters from all over the country. And you drive around Price County, for example, or here too for that matter, and see pickup trucks with dog kennels from all over the United States parked on the woods roads and whatnot with these people looking for grouse and woodcock, and they're up here and they spend a lot of money and they have a good time, and like I said, it's a good thing for the Northwoods. So grouse are on the rebound. I mentioned bears. Ooh, wolves. Why did I want to bring that up? No, I don't. Forget that. No wolves. We can talk about that too if you have questions. I suspect that with the new administration and government, that when they can sort through some of the other craziness that's going on, like our North Korean leader and a few other issues, maybe they'll get down to taking wolves off the endangered species list, which returning them to state management I think would be a very good thing. So we can get back to that. Waterfowl numbers, the ice is opening up. I had a pair of wood ducks buzz me in a little pond next to the house, next to our cabin last night, so they're coming back quickly. But the good news on the waterfowl front, holy mackerel, for the last 3 years, continental waterfowl populations have been the highest populations recorded since they started paying attention to them in the 1950s. There are lots, not necessarily in every place or with every species of duck, but overall, waterfowl populations are doing very, very well. The restoration of elk has been going very well. You probably saw in the papers just in the last few days that they brought 28 more elk up from Kentucky. Seems odd that we'd be getting elk from Kentucky, but that's another long story. But that's where they're coming from, and there are another group of 28 currently being acclimated, and they'll be released this year to augment the herd over around Clam Lake and in that area. For the past 2 years, they've been used to hopefully start a successful herd down around Black River Falls. So I think there are 2 more years on that 5-year plan to bring elk up from Kentucky to help with the restoration effort here in Wisconsin. The elk were hanging on, but there wasn't nearly as much herd growth as they had hoped for since they were restored in 1995. What other species did I have down here? We've already talked a little bit about the turkeys. So I guess with that's about a half an hour of rambling. I think it's time to let you take control of the situation.
First of all, I have an observation, and that's that once in a while I transfer small creatures to another life cycle, but I don't hunt with a gun. But I think we need another way to fund you. I would pay money to fund the research and the things you are doing. So you can tell us if there are any of those opportunities. But here's my real question, and I want to know if you know that if I walked these grounds in 1850s, what would I see for mammals and wolves, and what was the ecology like, and how has mankind impeded or promulgated some of these outlier species?
2 interesting questions, and I'd be inclined to answer yes and no, but I don't think that'll be satisfactory. On the financial front, there have been numerous attempts to try and pass legislation that would be an analog to the Pittman-Robertson program that would tax other things used by folks who enjoy the outdoors, be it binoculars, field guides, kayaks, or whatever. That has really never gone anywhere to any great extent. The other hope was that perhaps Wisconsin could see the light and convince their citizens of the merit of the approach used in Minnesota and Missouri and a couple other states where there's a small fraction of a percent added to the sales tax but directed to conservation. And even, I think it's 1/8% in Missouri, and it may be even less than that in Minnesota. But when you're talking about the billions of dollars, all of a sudden it's a tremendous funding string to their conservation departments. So those are the two big attempts that some other states have been able to take advantage of. We have not. There's also a federal attempt to broaden the use of the PR funds to be able to support, make it available, since there's quite a bit of money right now, be able to use it in other ways that were not stipulated in the legislation in 1937. So, but that brings up another point. One other thing I meant to mention was talking about things coming up here over the next couple of weeks. Something happens on April 15th. I can't remember exactly what it is, but oh, it's the 18th this year. Oh, great, I've got a little more time. But there are opportunities, certainly, for individuals with the Endangered Resources Fund in Wisconsin. That's one thing we do have, the so-called, I think it's a Loon symbol on the state tax form, and there's an opportunity for every taxpayer to there make a donation that's channeled toward conservation issues, primarily of non-game species. So there are a few opportunities. And of course, there are a gazillion things that an individual can do by getting involved with NGOs like things like Ducks Unlimited or Rocky Mountain Elk or Pheasants Forever, or groups that do a lot of really good education and land conservation work beyond just being advocates for that species because some of their members like to hunt them. Okay, that was the first one. Now let's see, the other one. Refresh my memory here. Oh, what would it look like a long time ago? Well, I arrived here in 1888, and so I can't speak for the 1850s, but so some of the things probably seen. There were certainly species here that have vanished. You'd have seen millions of passenger pigeons. They're gone. You'd have seen bison. They're gone. You might have gotten lucky and spotted a wolverine. They're gone. So there are a few other things that have disappeared. That was obviously human-induced, completely human-induced in the case of the passenger pigeon. So there's a human footprint issue. In terms of other species, were there wolves running every willy-nilly? The pre-settlement 1800s-ish wolf population, the only estimate I've ever seen, and it's probably more of a guesstimate than anything else, is that there might have been 20, 25,000 wolves all over Wisconsin at that particular time or point in history. But again, that's more of a guesstimate than anything else. There were many fewer deer, and the deer that were around were relegated to the northern part of the state, not the southern part of the state. There were more elk. I suspect that the small mammal complement, the things people don't think about very much, like shrews and voles and mice and squirrels and so forth, were around, but there was no one to really pay much attention to them. So I don't know, that's kind of a general picture, I think. But some things, as I mentioned, are probably, well, deer, for example, and some species that do well in association with humans, like raccoons and so forth, are probably far more abundant now than they were in 1850. Yes, sir.
I'm going to bring up a touchy subject.
Oh, good.
Wolves. There are a lot of people want to see the wolves off the endangered species list, politicians and others, and so they can start shooting them. What we don't hear about is the threatened species list. If the wolf is dropped to the threatened species list, we still can't hunt or trap them, but Wildlife Services does have the authority to take out problem wolves. And this would be good for the farmers, and I think in the long run, probably good for the wolves, because if people knew problem wolves were being dealt with, they'd be more accepting of the wolves. So I certainly hate to see a hunting and trapping season on wolves after everything we've done to them in the past.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I'm not necessarily, when I said I was in favor of them being removed from the endangered species list, it wasn't necessarily with the notion of hunting in mind. Although I'd have to say that for the 2 or 3 years that we did have hunting after they were removed, they've been like a ping pong ball for quite a long time. But the last time they were removed, I think it only took our legislature like 2 days to implement the hunting season or get that rolling. To the agency's credit, however, the strategy there was to attempt to keep the wolf population somewhere near what the wolf management plan had called for, and that they therefore tailored the hunting season with very tightly controlled permits so that they would actually have some effect on the population, but still keep it at what they felt was a viable number. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but I don't think any of the 3 years of harvest varied by more than 2 or 3 individuals from what the quota had been assigned to. So I think they demonstrated that they could do a very effective job of controlling the harvest as long as the harvest was being used to keep the wolf population where it minimized, tried to minimize the kinds of problems you described with livestock or pets or other such things, but still allowed the population. I think what happened was that, much as you described people being more supportive when they knew USDA's wildlife services could deal with problems, I think it was the same situation, even though very few people actually drew a tag to hunt or trap a wolf. The fact that some people could, I think, also provided some, well, now we have some control, so the pet depredations or bear hound problems or assorted with other things would also be diminished. Maybe yes, maybe no, but anyway, threatened species status or threatened status would be kind of a midpoint, I guess. Where are you, Dr. Bovey? Yes.
Yes, I deer hunt in southwestern Wisconsin. I can appreciate your story about your deer cam numbers on the decline, and probably because of CWD. There is a difference in management style between CWD in Illinois and Wisconsin, and I pointed that out to one of our local politicians. But that is not my question. My question really has something to do with the grouse population in southwestern Wisconsin. I hunted there as a young person,
And there were lots of
and there were
grouse.
lots of them, like really a lot, as many as up here. And I see none today. And do you have any reason? My own personal thought on it may have something to do with the turkey population. I don't know.
Okay, so the question deals with, boy, there used to be a lot of grouse in southwestern Wisconsin. That's absolutely correct. I actually arrived not in 1888, but in 1972 to go to graduate school, and my buddies and I hunted routinely in southwestern Wisconsin and had more flushes and better hunting than I have up here today. However, the habitat in southwestern Wisconsin has changed so much that those birds simply can't find what they need, and they've virtually died out. And if you want to get the specifics of that, the current upland biologist for the DNR, he's Scott Walter was the biologist for the DNR who handled grouse, turkeys, and whatnot. He left a couple of years ago, now works for the Rough Grouse Society. But if you track him down, when he was at UW Richland Center, he had several research projects using radio-marked grouse in southwestern Wisconsin, and he did just a beautiful job of demonstrating what had happened to the grouse in these patchy forested habitats that were left, or in the habitats that had been satisfactory but have grown up. One of my favorite spots to hunt was an old overgrown field right across the road from our deer camp, the demise of that. And now if I drive back there, you'd never know that there'd ever been a field there. And so the grouse habitat that was around that edge has disappeared. But in any event, Scott, between predation And habitat change has really done a beautiful job of demonstrating why the grouse have vanished from southwestern Wisconsin.
The habitat has certainly changed, and that has a lot to do with the increase in the deer herd
Right.
in their browsing.
Nothing really stays the same. And nature abhors a vacuum, and no matter what we do to the landscape, plant succession is almost impossible to beat, and it's going to happen in most cases. And because people have a rather short-term view of things, they don't see these changes happening until it's like, well, you know, you moved away from a town in southwestern Wisconsin, lived in California for 30 years, and all of a sudden you come back, oh my gosh, it's so different. But because it happens so slowly, incrementally, even if you're living there, you just don't notice it as dramatically. Yes?
Yes, I have a couple of comments, but also a couple of questions as well. As someone who's worked both in endangered resources for the state of Hawaii as well as worked for Ducks Unlimited, I'm really glad you brought up some of the initial comments that you made about the Pittman-Robertson Fund. I'm just out of curiosity, would like to know how many people actually have never heard of that before you brought it up tonight. Has anyone heard of Pittman-Robertson and how that money goes towards the states? I think that's one of our main issues with hunting and the conservation connections, is people don't understand where the money is coming from for those programs. And it's, you know, it is a bit of a challenge. When I worked for endangered resources, I always challenge my colleagues because we know more about game animals than we know about endangered resources, because game species that are hunted, get a lot more money through a dedicated funding source. And yet we don't have dedicated funding sources for endangered resources and those habitats and, you know, areas that are required to protecting endangered species. And there are so many more endangered species that there's, you know, it's a competition. Whereas with hunted species, game species, it's kind of like there's parity. You understand the populations and they all kind of get equal treatment, but that's not necessarily true with endangered species. Because there's such a limited amount of money, the gentleman who brought up the question of where does the funding come from and how can we actually not split the pie smaller, but maybe grow a few more pies or grow a bigger pie and slice it, you know, so that things get a little bit more fairly distributed. So that's just a comment. I'm glad you brought that up because I think that's a very important part of conservation education and hunting education, is so people understand where the money is coming from.
If you weren't familiar with PR or Pittman-Robertson, you're probably less familiar with Dingle Johnson.
Dingle Johnson, yeah.
You know what that one is?
That's
It's
another,
the analog to PR, but for fisheries.
Yes, for fish.
So tax on fishing tackle, marine fuel, things like that, comes back to the state, to the fisheries department to support their work. So I guess the lesson is that the consumptive users, the people who catch fish or hunt game, have been footing the bill for a long time. Whether or not, I guess the political climate right now is that if Pittman-Robertson had not been put in effect in 1937, could something like that survive in today's legislative
Probably not.
tone?
Yeah, probably not.
Probably
but it was a really very well thought out, you know, program, and it reminds me of how it was those legislative, just kind of, important legislation that was passed in the late 30s that really prompted the conservation movement in the United States, which in turn prompted the conservation movement around the world. Mm-hmm. And there's a direct line between hunting regulations, developing hunting, and protecting habitat for species. I do have a question though too about, because I don't hunt anymore, but I did grow up in a family in the South where we did do a lot of hunting, and but I've seen some changes, but I don't want to necessarily disparage people in Wisconsin, but the hunting education seems to have taken a different path than when I was younger, and my family and stuff. And I also grew up in a place where we did hunt sandhill cranes. So this is a touchy subject. And the hunting of sandhill cranes is a lot different than hunting of other species. And I do highly recommend people, read the rules that are going up before the Conservation Council, because it seems disingenuous that they want to initiate a crane hunting program now in order to protect farmers and their loss of crops. Because the hunting seasons for cranes, like waterfowl, are always in the fall. So they don't do anything to minimize crop depredation in the spring. And in addition, going back to hunting education, I don't know what your feeling is as far as like really developing the skills and developing the kind of moral ethics behind hunting, that cranes really do require a very, very time-consuming, very patient hunting approach without mauling a bunch of cranes if you don't do it right. And that's my concern, is because in a lot of those areas where they do hunt cranes, you have a higher percentage of non-lethal kills. And that's one of the issues that I think has to be dealt with when we introduce a crane hunting program, of making sure there's a hunting education component that goes into that. And I don't know if anyone else here, I know people are on the Conservation Council, if they can address that, or if you can address it.
Yeah, I can. Okay, well, as far as the crane situation is concerned, and then I'll say something about hunter ed, Wisconsin had no heritage for turkey hunting either in the 1980s when turkeys were restored. And we had no heritage for dove hunting 10 years ago when dove hunting was first proposed. But hunters are quick to learn what tactics and techniques are necessary to successfully harvest those species. And I suspect they'd catch on to crane hunting pretty quickly too. Cranes are very wary and difficult to hunt, but they are hunted successfully in some states. And I do a lot of game cooking, and if you've never had sandhill crane breast on a grill, it's about as good as it gets as far as wild game is concerned. So, in any event, I'm not too worried about the situation in terms of Wisconsin hunters rather quickly catching on to how to do that the right way and to be successful. As far as hunter ed is concerned, I think hunter ed is essential. It's been one of the great changes over the years since it became mandatory, I think in 49 or 59, I think. And every session I conduct of this conservation leaders hunting awareness class I teach around the country, the hunter ed people always show the image of the decline in hunting incidents, fatalities, and injuries since hunter education became mandatory to the present time. It's a steady decline. And you just don't hear about, yes, there are tragic injury incidents or accidents, if you want to call them that still, but many less than there used to be. So everybody points this as being a huge success story. And yet now, again, in an attempt to, in the effort to recruit more people, hunter ed is sometimes described as an obstacle to people participating. So there are, in different states, test out options. You don't even have to go to a class. You can do it online. You fill out the exam. If you pass it, boom, you're in. Or in the case of kids now, 10 and 11-year-olds can hunt with a mentor before they've had hunter education. And there are all sorts of other things like that being done, and it seems to cast aside or not pay, in my mind, due attention to the fact that you can't have it both ways. You can't say this is absolutely essential to hunter safety and proper activity in the field, but then say, well, it's not that important. You know, we need to make it easier for people to hunt. That doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And as far as your comments about game species deriving, more attention, it's kind of a squeaky wheel gets the grease kind of thing. If people are very concerned about a certain species, then they tend to get some attention, regardless of what their rationale is. We were very concerned about eagles, and they've been restored very nicely. But you're correct in saying that a lot of the management attention is directed at game species. What bothers me a little bit about that right now is that our system is built heavily heavily around one particular animal right now in the United States, which is what? Deer. Deer drive the system. If you go back to that survey data I was talking about and look at the data 30 years ago or 40 years ago, there were something like 10 million recreation days of small game hunting, rabbits, squirrels, things like that, and about 5 million for deer hunting. It's completely flip-flop now. So kids who are being brought along, like five-year-old Cody here, instead of being out with grandpa learning how to hunt by chasing rabbits or squirrels with a .22, his introduction is with a high-powered centerfire rifle on a trophy deer. What interest is there then in small animals when, here you've got a 200-pound animal? Maybe it's just a sign of the times and people are interested in instant gratification or something bigger. Squirrels just aren't worth worrying about anymore, but I view that as a bit of a problem as well, especially if the deer situation, as Mike might have portrayed to you, is kind of built on a house of cards. If chronic wasting disease or something else really has the effect on the deer herd that some of the scientists think it can, then all of a sudden a system, we've built a system around an animal that eventually may not be able to support that system. Okay.
What does eagle taste like?
Chicken.
Scott, there's hunters in the group here. There's a lot of non-hunters in the group here. And some states have a conservation card where they require everyone and every adult to, in some way or another, purchase a conservation card. Michigan, before you can buy any other hunting license, and in Ontario also, you have to buy a conservation card first. Now, seeing as the Robinson-Pittman Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act are about as far as they're going to be taken in a modern day Congress, okay, what would you say to somebody, just a state saying, and a couple of states have done this, taking $10 off of everybody's taxes straight off the top, and it goes to game and non-game species?
I'd be fine with that personally, but this is Wisconsin in 2017, and for crying out loud, we're going to get rid of our 90-year-old state magazine that pays for itself and educates people about our wildlife resources. What are the odds that we're going to get a $10 bill from everybody in the state? I think right now, the current climate, we have to rely more on volunteerism, and there are certainly things people can do if they believe strongly enough about this kind of thing. Hey, everybody should go out and buy a duck stamp. Go to the post office and buy a duck stamp. You don't have to hunt with it. They're usually pretty. You can collect them, whatever you want, but that money goes directly back to wetland conservation, buying wetlands across North America where you can go and bird watch or hunt ducks or whatever else. So there are things people can do, but it's sometimes a tough sell. The hunters have been paying. Whether some would voluntarily do that or not, I don't know. Hunters are, a lot of people paint hunters with a broad brush and say, well, every hunter's like every other hunter. That's not the case. There's a tremendous variation in commitment level. Just before the deer season this past year in Wisconsin, the Go Wild system sold over 100,000 licenses the day before the deer season. That leads me to conclude, sure, some people, I just forgot about it kind of thing, but that leads me to believe there are probably quite a few people out there who don't even decide they're going to go until somebody calls, says, hey, we got a spot at the deer camp, come on along, we'll play cards and have some steaks or whatever. They buy a license and go. That doesn't strike me as being the level of commitment that somebody who's been planning their hunt for 6 months or whatever probably has. And if you start to factor in the costs of some types of hunting now, an extra $10 here or $10 there, geez, a box of some centerfire rifle cartridges now, if you've again, been conscientious and decided to use solid copper bullets instead of lead, you could be paying 50, 60 bucks for a box of 20 rifle cartridges because of that commitment dealing with lead, which is a toxic substance, but still widely used. So there's all sorts of ins and outs to this stuff, but there are ways, if people are really committed as individuals, that they can help whether they hunt or not. And there's one other thing, another bit of data, not from that national survey, but from a variety of other polling groups. What do you suppose, I realize this is a mixed audience. We could take a poll here, but I'm not going to. But let's just take a shot at it here. Over the last 40 years, give or take, what has been, and this has been a very stable number, what percentage of the American public, qualified by how the question is phrased, but what percentage of the American public in general says they support sport or recreational hunting? What percentage? Mind you, only 5% or less of the public hunts. But what percent would say they support hunting? Yeah, it's actually a little more. It's bounced around right around 75 to sometimes as high as 80%. Now, what else? The caveat is that you say, if the meat is used, as long as the provision or the proviso is that, yes, these people are hunting, but they're utilizing the meat, the support has been pretty standard at 75 or 80%. What the heck else in the United States these days could you get 80% of the citizens to agree on? I mean, I think that's fantastic. So what it means is that the smaller groups that hunters are always uptight about, or that the resource agencies are uptight about, like some of the dedicated anti-hunting, anti-trapping, anti-whaling groups or whatever, is a very small minority. They're powerful and well-funded, but the point is, the bulk of Americans, if the meat is used, support hunting. I think that's great. If you start to move down to other categories of hunting, how many support trophy hunting? That has a somewhat negative connotation. All of a sudden, the percentages go way down. But I'm okay with the people using meat, and hey, that's a pretty good support level. Okay, I digressed there for a bit. Yes? One more, then we're going to take a break?
Yes.
Yes, everybody needs a beer.
Right.
Or two. Yes, sir.
I understand historically, northern Wisconsin used to be an important stopover for snow geese. And I read recently, particularly at Powell Marsh, but I read recently that that's no longer the case. Can you confirm that, or maybe to help me us understand why that's no longer the case?
You know, snow geese and white-fronted geese are more of a western species and far more common in the central and Pacific flyways, particularly the central, than they are in this flyway. And you occasionally see a flock of snow geese blown a little east or whatever, but it's my impression that we were never a very important stopover. Snow geese like big open country, as you see them in these huge fields and whatnot in the Dakotas and Nebraska and down into Kansas and Arkansas and so forth, in flocks of 5, 10, 15,000 birds. So there was a flock of 500 or 600 on a wetland outside Madison last week, mixed in with the swans, but that's a pretty unusual sighting, actually. So we're just barely on these huge masses of snow geese moving south or north. We're right on the eastern fringe. And there's really not much we can do about that. Wisconsin just isn't very attractive to them.
I ring the Salvation Army bell every day during the season, and this year much of my time was spent next to a truckload of corn. At our local grocery store, they had a truckload sale of corn. And I know last month was chronic wasting disease, but I also know that there's a proposal to change the deer baiting and feeding rules in the state. And my kind of take on it is, if we don't have any enforcement on the current baiting law, maybe we should, because I can tell you the corn was leaving there, and it wasn't farmers buying the corn.
Well, that's a good one to start off with for the second part of the session here. You know, it's no secret that every grocery store, convenience store, and everything else has a big pile of 50-pound sacks of corn. And because I'm a little sensitive to CWD, I got into it at Save More here a couple of years ago. I was in line, and the guy behind me was paying for 10 bags of corn, and I said, I made some snide remark, "Oh, you feeding squirrels?" And he mumbled something, and that was kind of the end of it. But the feeding and baiting situation is supposed to be two separate things, but it's hard to separate them. The baiting issue for hunting purposes, personally, I would like to see that go away because it's kind of self-perpetuating. I think the term defensive baiting was coined in this area, where you get people who really don't want to put out bait for deer, but they do it because all the neighbors are, and if I don't bait because they're baiting, I'm not going to see anything. So that's defensive baiting. If no one was doing it, then you wouldn't have to worry about that kind of thing. I think there are many ways to harvest deer that don't necessarily require a pile of corn. That's the issue of fair chase, but the other issue, of course, is that people like Mike and all the people I know who work with the disease issue just strongly believe that concentrating deer on a pile of anything, whether it's for baiting or you want to see them out the kitchen window or whatever else, is potentially detrimental to their survival. So, but I also fully recognize that it is a very difficult thing to enforce. Folks who have nothing to do with hunting really just enjoy seeing the deer out of the cabin window, and if that's their interaction with wildlife, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that. But at least scatter the corn around a little bit so that they're not all in one place drooling on each other. I don't know if that answers your question. It's a very contentious thing in Wisconsin. It kind of goes back and forth like this. A couple of years ago, it seemed like it had gone just past the even Steven mark, and there was a chance that feeding or baiting rather might be banned. But I know that, and now there's a legislator promoting that after 2 years of a baiting and feeding ban because of chronic waste disease discovery, that after I think it's 2 years, well, you can go ahead and feed and bait again. Everything's great. Well,
Yeah, we let people plant alfalfa in the middle of their 40-acre pine forest.
right. Well, then there's the other problem of okay, so what's the difference between a food plot, some of which are quite elaborate, and a pile of corn? That's a philosophical argument we're not going to be able to answer very well either. But at least in the case of the food plot, which is a very common practice, the animals are A, dispersed a little more, and B, the food plot often has a lot of value for a lot of other things, including some non-game animals. So that's maybe a thin rationalization, but hey, it's all I got.
Yeah. We have a question online. So, oops, I've lost my thing. Hang on a sec. This is a question that came over from the library. What about loon populations in regards to eagles? Are eagles eating loon eggs?
Not the eggs, I don't believe, but of course, if you live on the lake and watch the way loons behave when an eagle flies over, clearly the loons are a little fidgety about that situation. So I think there might be some risk to chicks, but not to the eggs. But I mean, the issue here is that right now we've got pretty good populations of both, and nature is not a very kind, benevolent situation. Stuff eats other stuff, and we don't like to see it, but if you've got a Cooper's hawk working your bird feeder and you're sitting there with your Cheerios some morning and the Cooper's hawk is plucking your favorite cardinal on the deck railing, people get really agitated about that, but the reality is it's a perfectly normal thing, and people have to accept that. As long as the fundamental problem is that people who manage our resources for us, and wildlife is a public trust resource in the United States, have to be concerned about the well-being of the population. If loons are doing well and eagles are doing well, okay, the fact that the eagles might nab a loon chick once in a while, well, cost of doing business. But people are generally not concerned about the population. They're concerned about the pair of loons that's on their lake, or the eagle that's nesting in a big white pine just down the shoreline or whatever. And it's population, schmopulation. If my loon's doing okay and my eagle's doing okay, and people become very protective of the wildlife on their property or in their backyard, even though it is a public trust resource. That's one of the biggest problems in a state like Wisconsin, and especially to the east of us, where most of the habitat is in private hands. The wildlife, public trust resource, it belongs to all of us. We all share equally in the wildlife. But where does it live? It lives on private land. The private landowner controls access. So access and public trust wildlife butt heads fairly frequently. Okay. Yes, sir.
Hi.
I've been hoping you'd ask a question. I knew you were excited about this, so go ahead.
I am excited. I'm curious about wolves. You mentioned that before European expansion, there were about 25,000 wolves statewide, as a guesstimate.
Wide guess. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Fire away.
I don't really have a frame of reference for that number. So my first question is, how many wolves are in Wisconsin today? And my follow-up question is, what are the ecological impacts to a bigger wolf population or a smaller wolf population?
Well,
30 seconds.
First of all, the numbers game is a very tricky one because personally I have a reasonable amount of faith in the survey work that's done by the agency and all their volunteers doing the winter tracking and surveying the packs that have a radio-collared individual in them and so forth. So I think we got up to the point last winter where the number was beginning to push 900. It had been fluctuating at around 600 to 800. And the original population goal in the management plan was 350. So, and depending on who you ask in any tavern from Wausau North, there may be anywhere from 3 to 33,000. That's again a quirk of human nature. People are suspicious. Wolves are being seen with some regularity. Dogs are being killed, etc. So there's some suspicion there. But after the pupping season, the population might shoot up to 1,600 or more for a short period of time in the early summer when all wildlife populations reach their seasonal high, and then it trickles off. A lot of the young ones die, and come next winter, you're back down at 8 or 900 or whatever. So there's always some debate over the numbers. The next level of debate that comes in is how many is enough? How many of these things do we need? Well, we need on one end enough to be relatively certain that there's a viable population. I think most people would agree, hey, they're a native species. Enough people are concerned about the demise of wolves on Isle Royal that there's all sorts of thinking about what to do about that. Same thing in Wisconsin on a larger scale, that whatever the minimum viable population is, whether it's 350, you can argue that, or maybe it's 550. But as they begin to creep up, they start to bump heads with the human population. We have a pretty heavy footprint on the landscape, and we have livestock, and we have pets, and we're out with hunting dogs and whatnot. So it doesn't become as much of an issue of how many wolves Wisconsin could support as it does how many are the people who live with them willing to tolerate. And so there's great debate over what that number is. As long as you asked about what the implications are of too few, the implication there is that, all right, so wolves die out again, and we're back in the matter of how we're going to restore wolves. And on the other end, how many is enough will, I don't believe, ever be completely resolved. And that doesn't really matter if the decision was, well, we need 5,000, but you have a faction who think there are 500 and another faction who think there are 50,000, and there's some distrust over the techniques of figuring out how many there are, then that's a tough nut to crack. Did that answer your question? I confused myself with that answer, so.
If there's time to talk about the ecological impacts.
Oh, well, I mean, the big ecological impact that people are uptight about, discounting human animals, cows and dogs and whatnot, is the impact on the deer herd. And it doesn't necessarily have to be direct consumption. I think the general thinking is that if wolves ate nothing all year, nothing but deer, I think the thinking is the numbers are somewhere around 17, 18, 19, 20 deer would support a wolf for an entire year. Say 20 for the sake of argument. And for the sake of math, we got 1,000 wolves. It's probably a little more in the winter than we have. 1,000 times 20, the wolves could eat 20,000 deer. We squash more than that on the state's highways every year. So is that a big deal? Well, the problem, of course, is that that's not evenly distributed across Wisconsin like the highway mortality is. And if the deer are being eaten 50 yards from the back of your hunting camp, that's a different problem. And it's not just what is eaten. The people who deal with them around their hunting camps, if a wolf pack is active in the area, the deer aren't completely stupid. They're not going to hang around there. They're going to go over here. So even if they're not eating or killing or chasing all the deer or some of the deer around the little piece of the landscape that you're concerned about, they may have displaced the animals. The past couple of winters on the little lake I'm on in Price County, I don't see many deer over there anymore, but every deer that I saw was in a group of 15 to 20 at any one time, right in the middle of the lake, standing on the ice. I said, what the heck is going on there? The neighbor said, well, that's where they stay all day long because there's a pack active around our lake, and they can see them coming, and on the ice they can, wolves are over there, phew, we go this way, and they can get out of harm's way. But we got up to the cabin last February. The neighbor called and said, hey, you might want to come up and look at the end of your dock. So we came up, and anyway, that pack had killed a doe about 20 feet from the end of our dock, and it was incredible to see. There was an area, twice the size of this room, just completely trampled, and a mix of deer hair and blood spots and whatnot, and all that was left was a little football-sized rolled-up piece of hide lying in the middle of that, and then 7 sets of wolf tracks going across the snow, across the lake. And, it was kind of, I thought, that's kind of neat to see. My wife didn't share that viewpoint, but that's why it's an interesting thing. Everybody's response to that kind of thing is a little different. But, again, the numbers game is such that if that's the big impact. They eat other things, certainly. So the number of deer killed is probably something less than that. But if it's the old adage about whose ox is being gored. Is that what it is? Or something like that. Anyway, if it's your area that's being impacted, you're pretty concerned and you're being impacted. But somebody 20 miles away, it may be a non-issue.
What about badgers?
Well, that buzzer beater by Florida the other night was just, it was terrible. Badgers are one of those things that kind of fall through the cracks. Everybody's, I think, sensitized to badgers because they're the mascot of the university and all that. There's one there. But they're not very abundant, but they're not exactly uncommon either. Most people don't see them very often. I've, in a lot of looking, not seen a live one in this state. I've picked up 4 or 5 roadkills over the years. But they're distributed statewide. They're not especially abundant, but when you find one, landowners will frequently call, and they've found a den, set up a trail camera or a blind, get all sorts of cool pictures of badgers, and it's kind of neat to have them around, but not everybody shares in that. So they're one of those animals that's here. They're not at any particular risk. They're not intensively managed. They're not hunted. They're occasionally removed or controlled for damage control purposes, but that's about it.
Do they eat the chickens or the tomato plants?
I don't think they're too concerned about tomato plants, but I mean, they're a big member of the weasel family, so they're strictly carnivorous, and they'll eat what they can catch, but they're particularly fond of ground squirrels and woodchucks and things like that. So not nearly as much of a risk to the chicken coop as many other weasels that are more of a problem and a lot more stealthy. Yes, and there's one up in the back there too, Vanna.
My question is about, you had mentioned the lead issues, and I'm just wondering what your views are on the effects that lead is having on, not necessarily waterfowl, but eagles and loons, and not only from maybe loons eating lead tackle, but also eating fish that maybe have done that, and eagle eating on deer that have possibly been shot with lead shot and things like that too.
Well, I mean, lead's been around for a long time. It has properties that made it very suitable for shot pellets, for shotguns, and for rifle bullets because it's very dense and so on and so forth, and it was cheap to produce, so it's been around for a long time. But people are also, and have been for a long time, aware that it's toxic and deposited in the environment, it can cause a variety of problems. First, I think the most intensive concern was over waterfowl that were picking it up as grit, and as it was eroded in their gizzards, there were many thousands of ducks, geese, and swans were dying of lead poisoning, and as a result, lead shot for waterfowl hunting was banned a couple decades ago. The next steps in that have been much slower to come. So there were some steps taken, for example, on public lands in Wisconsin. You have to use steel or non-toxic shot for dove hunting. On private lands, not so. There were some bans put in place on our national wildlife refuges and whatnot where hunting takes place, and those were just rescinded by the new Secretary of the Interior. But there was some squirrely stuff going on with that, so that isn't as big a deal as it may seem. I guess my opinion is that it's slow coming, but because of some of the recent studies about the performance of alternatives to lead, it's just as good ballistically. It may be a little more expensive now, but once it's in mass production, it won't be. That the early adopters have already switched to copper rifle bullets and so on. And eventually that'll be the law of the land, but it's going to take a long time. And there's a tremendous inventory of ammunition already held in private hands that would be likely grandfathered in, and it'll take years and years for that to be sorted out. So I think the transition is occurring by people who have decided on their own, legally by provisions like California protecting the condors and mandating non-toxic rifle bullets in the range of the condors. It'll come piecemeal, and it'll come eventually voluntarily, but it's going to be a long time.
Yeah, my question relates to land conservation, and I'll use the word conflict between development and retaining habitable lands for wildlife. And does Wisconsin have any policies in place, or is the state considering implementing any policies? Because to me, it seems like a very contentious issue, because all you have to do is look at development in the North and South Kettle Moraines, and it's just quite amazing from my perspective what has happened over the last 30 years as far as development is concerned.
Depending on how far back you want to go, there are ample opportunities on every lake here in Oneida County that development has just about proceeded to the extent that it can. It seems to be, at least on the lakeshore property, through the work of some of our land trusts and so forth, not the state, but rather private land trusts like the Northwoods Land Trust over in Eagle River, with people who are have the mindset of not wanting to see further development. If they're lucky enough to have a large lakeshore holding, then conservation easements and that kind of thing can protect that land long term. But there are a lot of people, and there are more people all the time, and attempting to stop development, I don't think that's ever going to happen. But it's clear that every time a woodlot is knocked down or a parking lot is paved or whatever, habitat for something has been lost, which to me circles back to this notion of how many hunters can the landscape support. It's a matter of, in your case, how much wildlife can the landscape support, but then the users of that wildlife are further constrained because they're packed into smaller and smaller areas. So it's the same question with wolves. How many wolves is enough? How many hunters is enough? How many people can we provide some sort of a quality experience for with some chance of success in Wisconsin before it's just too damn crowded? Development is going to proceed, though, except for land that's set aside. Wisconsin has programs like the Stewardship Fund and so forth, but that's under attack constantly, and the state's actually liquidating some lands rather than necessarily buying more. So the government seems to be at kind of a standstill, but there are well-meaning private citizens who are protecting their lands long-term. That's a very good thing.
Hi, thank you. My question is based on the concerns that I have as a mother, also a gardener, and a beekeeper. Recently, there's been a lot of research based on the white nose disease for bats.
For bats?
And then also the hive collapse. This is a deep concern, and just wondering, based on what you know with the research, what exactly are we doing in the next decade to protect our natural pollinators in the state of Wisconsin?
Well, as far as the bats are concerned, white nose syndrome was discovered not long ago, 2006 in New York, and it only took less than 7 or 8 years to cover most of the eastern seaboard, and now it reached Wisconsin 2 years ago. It was inevitable it would get here, but the good news was we had enough warning that the bat team with the Wisconsin DNR and the Natural Heritage Group had been able to put regulations in place dealing with everything from cavers using some of these hibernacula to making some of them inaccessible to the survey work necessary to see where it was and how fast it was spreading. I don't know of anything yet that the scientists have come up with that allow it to be cured or a cave treated, for example, so that it wouldn't affect them. But at least we were ahead of the curve in getting regulations in place that would slow its spread a little bit. But white nose syndrome is a serious threat to all of the cave or hibernating bats, and nobody seems to know where that's going to end either. But there are good people working on it, and we were a little ahead of the curve. As far as colony collapse disease, as far as honeybees are concerned, I don't know much more than what I see in probably the same gardening magazines and so forth that you may look at. It's a problem, but in terms of any magic solution, I don't know of one, and I also don't know what's being done about it either. A little out of my turf, but my also retired colleague Phil Pelletieri knows a lot about that, and he'd probably still respond to an email, especially if you said, Craven told me to get in touch with you. So that's all I can tell you on that.
Question right over there.
I wondered if you could comment on coyotes, and apparently they do well in the urban and suburban areas, and is there the relationship between coyotes and wolves and how they're doing in the state, good or bad?
Coyotes are sort of like badgers. They're widespread. Their habitat niche is much broader than badgers. They do very well in urban areas. And my colleague, the fellow who replaced most of my responsibilities on campus, is involved in something called the Urban Canid Project, which you could Google and come up with their information. They're studying coyote and red fox populations literally right on campus and in the suburbs of Madison. The coyotes are around. People don't often see them. When they do see them, they're sometimes just dismissed as a dog. They don't make nearly as much noise here in Wisconsin as they do in the western states. I'm not sure why, but that's been the case for a long time. There's a group that roams around my home south of Madison, and I think they cover a fair bit of ground, but when the windows are open in the summer, about every 4 or 5 days, we'll hear them go through my prairie, and they're yipping and barking and whatnot. So we know they're there, but rarely see them. As far as their interactions, and there are a lot of coyotes. I don't think anybody has a population estimate, but there are plenty of them in every type of habitat you could think of. As far as their interactions, the wild canids, the wild dogs, wolves, coyotes, and fox, don't play well together. So given an opportunity, the wolves will kill or displace coyotes, and the coyotes will kill or displace fox. So they kind of eventually reach a fluid dynamic where, yeah, they're over here, pack of wolves over here, there's some coyotes kind of around the fringe, the foxes are relegated to somebody's backyard, and so on. So that's just the way it's always been.
How are we doing? One more question? We've got one more.
We have to get to the alligators.
Oh, yeah, okay. We have, no, I'm sorry. Just wait, please. We have a question in back.
You're
And then we'll
next.
get to you in a minute.
You're next.
And then we'll get to alligators.
Well,
I'm not a hunter myself, but my son is a fourth-generation member of a family hunting camp up here, also a graduated badger from UW-Madison. He has an 11-month-old daughter that he hopes to someday be a fifth-generation hunter of that hunting camp. My question to you is, there's a lot of different ways we can look at the impact that is going to be on her life in the next 16 years, but could you discuss what you see global warming's impact is going to be on the hunting population
well, I
or
can't
the
talk
wildlife?
about that.
Yes, you can, because you're retired.
Well, okay, so this daughter in the family may grow up to be a hunter. That's quite likely because the two fastest growing segments in the hunting community are actually women and folks who are being compelled to enter the hunting group, if you will, because of their interest in non-commercially raised meat that's not treated with steroids, growth hormones, that's good for you, and so forth. So two of the successful arms of this hunter recruitment are folks motivated by acquiring their own protein and women. So that's a good thing. What will be around in 10 years or 100 years because of climate change is a little more difficult to pin down. Assuming you accept the, to me, overwhelming science that something's going on, there will certainly be changes in the way animals behave. Some animals that are tuned into. Well, I think the kinds of things. Did you say Magnuson has been here, or?
No, well, yes, but
Yeah.
a couple years ago.
Well, so John Magnuson spoke to this group a couple of years ago about ice-on dates and how that's changed dramatically over the last few decades in terms of how long the ice is on our lakes. And there are all sorts of other phenological events like that. When stuff starts blooming in the spring, when do the robins get back? All that stuff is shifting, and that will affect species that people are interested in terms of game species. So over time, seasons may have to be adjusted, and some species will perhaps benefit from the change and some won't. If things continue to go the way they are, we'll be seeing armadillos knocking on the doorstep of the Illinois border before too long. So changes in species range could change. Brook trout that are really tuned into cool waters as opposed to brown trout, their distribution in the state may virtually disappear. But that's all kind of long-term stuff. There are some really nice references as a compendium of what all the various sporting groups think about climate change and its impact on fishing and hunting in two books that you could Google. One's called Season's End, and one's called Beyond Season's End. And it's all little vignettes from things like Trout Unlimited or Ducks Unlimited in terms of what may happen in the face of climate change. And if they're interested in hunting, I would suggest finding either of those. Okay?
One question.
Right.
And then one in front.
Okay.
And then we'll.
I'm confused. Is the whitetail population good or bad? And I gotta- I gotta
White-tailed
follow
what?
too. And to follow up, I grew up 20 miles from Clam Lake, and I still live there where they introduced the elk. And my question about the whitetail, and why do we have to reintroduce more elk? My answer is because our wolf and our black bear population is mismanaged. Why are we losing elk when we're not hunting them?
Well, I think the slow growth, the slower than hoped for growth in the elk herd has been in part because of predation. And bears have, I think, been shown to be a much more effective predator on things like calves, calf elk, and fawn whitetails than most people thought. I mean, it's a compressed interval, but it's important. So predation, highway mortality, stuff that perhaps they didn't anticipate could have quite as much impact as it has. Right here, Scott.
The bobcat
wait.
population, is it existent or not too much?
The the question deals with bobcat population, and they seem to be doing very well. That came up a moment ago during the break, and our surrounding states seem to be even more liberal than we are in terms of harvest. But bobcat, I think the measure of the success of the bobcat population right now is the number of bobcats that seem to be expanding their range down from the northern third of the state where they're historically abundant down the western part of the state into the driftless area. So bobcat sightings have become commonplace in that area, and they're probably continuing on even beyond that down into Illinois and Iowa. Bobcats are very widely distributed in the country.
Is there a hunting season in the state for
Yes,
bobcat?
yes, there
And
is.
when is it, out of curiosity?
Can you
When is
repeat
the
that, please?
fall hunt like most of the other species?
We saw a young bobcat during the winter, which was very unusual. It was a snowy day. Went round the house, appeared out into the woods back past the patio door. Beautiful.
Well, they're beautiful animals, so it's one of those things that people don't see very often, so when they do, they're pretty excited about it.
Okay, alligators.
Time is it? All right, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of the alligator situation. So this alligator hunting expedition had been planned for quite some time, and I have a friend who managed the alligator program for Central Florida, and he had hooked me up with this guide on the east coast of Florida. And as I said, my son and I arrived not knowing very much about the situation because the guy had said, yep, I can handle this on April, whatever it was, and just be here. And I kept sending him emails, said, yeah, what do we need for boots and what should we do about this? And I'd ask a dozen questions, but the response I got was always the same. It said, yep, that sounds good. See you on the 19th of April. And so we arrived at the guy's house. I'll just highlight some of the more humorous things. And we hooked up with the guy. It turned out he was a nice guy. His day job was designing guidance systems for the missiles at Cape Kennedy. So he knew what was going on. He just hunted alligators because he liked to. And I still don't know his assistant, One-Eyed Jeff. Well, I don't know where he came from or what happened to his eye. But that had apparently happened a long time before because we ran into other guides when we finally got to the ranch we were going to hunt on. And it was just a barrage of one-eyed jokes. And he'd apparently heard them all because it didn't seem to faze him at all. Anyway, one of the things we had to do when we got there was get my Florida alligator permits. So we had to go in the house and do this. Okay, great. As we were walking up to his very nice house, I heard this horrible racket on the roof. I said, what is that? Oh, it's those damn tree frogs that came in from somewhere. They're really big and they're obnoxious. Oh, well, I kind of like amphibians. I'd like to see one. And it was croaking or singing, a horrible screech, and it was clear the guy didn't like them. They must have kept him up at night, but it was in the gutter. And before I could do anything, One-Eyed Jeff leaped over me and banged on the gutter, and whomp! Down came a frog about the size of half a grapefruit, whomp, onto the patio. I said, whoa, that's a cool frog. And I made a lunge for it, but it went 2 hops and splat. It was up against what I thought was a basement window. I said, well, I got him now. So I lunged again and hit the window, but it wasn't a window. It was turned out to be the pet door for the guy's little dogs. So I pushed it in, and now the frog was in his dining room. And he didn't like him to begin with, so eventually a search found the frog behind their china hutch, and he eventually dispatched it and said, no more frogging, we're going to go deal with the permit. So we did all that, took care of the paperwork. He explained how the alligators would be killed if we harvested any. That's a very interesting thing in itself. There's no gunfire involved, or guns are not legal for alligator harvest in Florida, so all the nonsense you see on swamp people, they had nothing good to say about swamp people, by the way. They said all that tugging on them and them jumping around and all is all done for TV. But anyway, so we proceeded to drive to a big cattle ranch in Central Florida, and a lot of Central Florida is still really big ranches, which from the development standpoint is nice to know. Anyway, we were on a 45,000 acre ranch. The one across the road was 400,000 acres. But anyway, we proceeded after we got there, loaded up their equipment into an old John boat that we were going to hunt out of. And it must have been the original prototype John boat built in the 1700s. It was mostly 2x4s, and it was a piece of junk, but they threw a whole bunch of stuff in it, and away we bounced. By now it was getting dark. We started through the ranch, bouncing around, no roads, just bouncing through the countryside, and came to a ditch. And he said, okay, this is where we're going to load up. Okay? I didn't know how he was going to get the boat in the ditch, which was down there 10 feet below where we were, but it turned out he just kind of gerrymandered it around and then gave it a kick, and a boom, 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 whomp, and it was in the ditch. So he said, okay, here's the deal now. Who's going to actually... taking an alligator is teamwork down there. There are several steps. The first step is attaching a cable to the alligator so you can actually get it up to the boat. That was done with our choice of tools: crossbow, longbow, or harpoon. We were told by my friend who manages the alligator egg collection business in Central Florida, which is a huge business for the private landowners. That's another long story. But anyway, he said, oh, go with the harpoon. But for whatever reason, we opted for the crossbow. So he produced a wooden crossbow that looked like the original crossbow that Genghis Khan used when he marched out of Mongolia, but it had a green laser sight on it, so that seemed pretty good. Anyway, we loaded into the boat, and the ditch was only a few inches wider than the boat, and it's dark. And we started down the ditch, and bonk, hit a log, bonk, hit a rock, bonk, hit a tree, and pretty soon the guide who was standing up on the little deck that's in front of a John boat with my son, who was going to do the cable attachment, he turned around and he said, I'll sanitize the language a little bit, but basically he said to One-Eyed Jeff, who was running the little Minocqua trolling motor, he said, for crying out loud, you've hit every obstacle in the ditch. Before he could even finish the sentence, Jeff said, what the hell do you expect? I've only got one eye. And I said, okay. So we finally broke out into this pretty big lake, and it was really neat. It was just a great experience to be out in a big Central Florida swamp. Of course, it was 95 and humid, and there was a thunderstorm off in the distance. So all these big cypress trees with all the Spanish moss were periodically illuminated by lightning, and things were croaking and bellowing and screaming. And I realized immediately that if we fell overboard, we were dead for sure. But we got out on the lake, and the guide turned on a little headlamp, and he started looking around, and then he was counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He got up to 14, and I said, "What are you counting?" He said, "Alligators." And once he showed you how to look for their eyes, they were all over the place. So I think, this will be great. We're going to bop one, and we'll be home to watch the news at 10 o'clock. Didn't work out that way. So we roamed around there with that little John boat. At night, the alligators are kind of in the way bullfrogs here in the summer are out in the middle of the lake just kind of floating around. That's what the alligators were doing. So we'd come up to them. They'd just sit there looking at us, or if we bumped into them, there'd be a horrendous splash and they were gone. We were looking for a certain size. Alligators are a commodity in Florida. Forget about this public ownership nonsense for wildlife. Those animals are bought and sold by the landowners. So the guide had contracted with the ranch owner for a 9-foot alligator, 7 to 9 actually. That's what I said I wanted. So we were looking for the right alligator. We must have looked at 75 of them, never really found the right one. And finally the guy said, "All right, enough of this, we're leaving." So back through the ditch, bonk, 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 thump, back, load up the truck, go to another lake. Same deal. He looks around, they're all over the place here. So we started chasing them around, and finally I heard him say to my son, "Turn on the laser." And I saw an alligator, and just as he shot the crossbow bolt, the alligator dove, and it was a miss. Okay, we're getting the idea. Another one came, this is a big one. This is what we're after. But the alligator was looking right at us, and he said, "Shoot him right between the eyes." I said, "I don't think that's a good idea." I didn't say that except to myself. But anyway, he shot, and this comes up a little later in the story, and thunk, the bolt. Of course, the alligator's head was angled, so the bolt hit it at an angle, and their head's like concrete. It just bounced off. The alligator shook his head. He's gone. The bolt's gone. So, well, we lost that one. By then, he said, I was sitting on a cooler in the middle of the John boat, which I thought was filled with adult beverages, but that proved to be wrong also. Because at that point, the guide said, "All right, we've stirred up these alligators. We need to deploy the beef lung." I said, "I wonder what that means." And he said, "Get your butt off of that cooler. We need the beef lung." So that's what I realized I'd been sitting on. So they produced a whole cow lung, which is a pretty big piece of lung. They reduced it to 3 chunks. Poke your finger through it, and then they've got a long cable with a wine cork on it. They put the wine cork through the lung and then pivot it 90 degrees so that the lung is stuck on the cord, but no hook like you see on swamp people. He said, "We don't use a hook." He said, "If we hook a one and it's a little one, you got to keep it then, and that's not what you want. This is catch and release alligator hunting." So how does that work exactly? You just watch. So they'd throw a big jug out with the cord, and this big chunk of cow lung floats off across the lake. We put 3 of those out. Went back to shore. Now it's 1 o'clock in the morning, and we're still chasing around. We sat there for half an hour. He said, "Okay, let's go. Where are the jugs?" "There's one over there," just screaming across the lake. I said, "That's a good sign. The lungs don't drag the bucket like that." So he said, "All right," he said to me, "Your job is to grab the bucket and get a hold of the cable, and we'll see what we got." So we did, and I latched onto it, and the alligator was pulling us across the lake. And all of a sudden, twang, the cable snapped, which he muttered about, and he said that just never happens, but it did. So the alligator's gone, but the cable's still kind of strung out through the lake the way the gator was going and the way we were going. Well, one-eyed Jeff couldn't see that, so he kept the boat going, and pretty soon, whomp! He ran over the cable, it spun up on the propeller, and the motor died. So now we're in the middle of the lake, and there's alligators all around us, and we've got no motor. And as near as I could see, we didn't have a paddle either. But anyway, One-eyed Jeff began to fiddle with the motor. It wasn't getting anywhere, so the guy crawled past me and he said, "We got to take it apart." So they started putting motor parts on the seat next to me, and pretty soon there's a big splash. I said, "What was that?" "I don't know, part of the motor." And so that's it, we're doomed. Finally, they got the cable off, and they had a pile of parts, and he just said, "I put all the parts we've got back on, we'll see what happens." So they got it put back together, and he turned on the battery switch, and away we went. I said, "Oh, that was a close one." So we started out next alligator bucket. This time I got a hold of him, and the guides for any type of hunting or fishing know their business. So all he had to do was tug on it a little bit. This is a little one. So what do? He said, "That's why we use the wine cork." He said, "They swallow the cow lung, but the cork gets stuck in their throat." So he said, "Just pull up the slack and give it a sharp jerk." I said, "Okay." So I did that, and the old alligator goes, "Ah!" And the cork pops out of his mouth. The alligator swims away. No harm, no foul. So anyway, now we've got one jug left. We went out the middle of the lake, and that one was creeping across the lake, and I got a hold of that one, and he just gave it a little tug. He said, "This is the one we want." Okay. So he said to One-Eyed Jeff, he said, "Give me the surf casting rod." I said, "Oh, good, we're going to do some fishing, too." By now, it's 3 o'clock in the morning, and he starts, so on the end of this old beat-up fishing rod, there's a gigantic treble hook, leaded, so it's very heavy, like you do see on Swamp People. And he starts chucking that out in the direction the alligator's swimming and just starts bouncing along. He did that 6 or 7 times, and all of a sudden he said, "Here we go." And he gave it a tug, and that old rod just went down. What he'd done was snag the alligator with the hook. Their hide's pretty thick and heavy. So he said, "Now," he said, "between the cable and the fishing line, we're going to slowly get that animal to come up off the bottom." And he told my son, "Okay, now this is it's your turn here. Shoot the crossbow bolt into that loose skin on its throat or neck." And then he said, "We've got him." And the animal came up, and he did make a nice shot. And he said, "Now we just got to get him up to the boat." And he said, "Then you need to employ the bang stick." Me. I said, "What's that?" And he said, "One-Eye, give him the bang stick." So it's a big aluminum pole with a blank pistol cartridge in the end and a compression spring. No bullet. But he said, when the animal comes up next to the boat, I mean, these things are pretty big, as long as the boat. He said, when it comes up, you stand up, and as soon as you can, just tap him on the back of the head with the pole. Okay. So I'm balancing around, and here comes the animal. Anyway, I finally tapped it with the pole, and boom! The cartridge went off. The animal was instantly unconscious. It just kind of relaxed and stretched out. Then it was about 3 minutes of frantic action. Hauled the head in the boat, handed me a roll of electrical tape up the jaws. Okay, good. Now he said, "You got a pocket knife?" Yep, I gave him my pocket knife that I still carry, just a little Browning knife. And he had told us back at the house that the way the animals are actually, they're not shot or harpooned or anything else. He said, right on the back of their head, there's a little soft spot where the head joins the neck. He said, "I'll make a little incision in the skin." So he did that. The animal's unconscious. He said, "Now take your finger and put it in that incision and find where the spinal cord comes out of the skull." I said, "Geez." So I'm feeling around there in the dark. I think I got it. Okay. Then he handed me a little piece of wire. So at that point, it was just like a frog in high school biology class. He said, "Just take the wire, put it in that hole in the skull, move it a couple times, that's it." The animal's already unconscious, but as soon as the brain on an alligator is just a golf ball size thing. As soon as you do that, the animal's dead. And as soon as I touched it with that wire, it just kind of relaxed. That was it. It was dead. No blood, no frantic thrashing around, no nothing. It was actually pretty neat. So at that point, we hauled it in the boat. You have to immediately make a hole in the tail and put the CITES tag in it for harvest information. And at that point, I noticed, boy, the guide was looking mighty nervous. I said, "What's the problem, Scott?" "Well, this is a little bigger than I thought." "Well, good. Isn't that good?" "No, that's not good." So the way the deal works, he had contracted with the landowner for however many hundreds of dollars it was for a 9-foot animal. Once the alligators on private land get over 9 feet, it's $50 an inch for additional, or $600 a foot. So a truly huge animal like that one that they've been showing on a golf course in Florida the last couple of days on the news, that's a 13, 14 footer might be worth $4,000 or $5,000. I didn't want a $5,000 alligator, but apparently that, whatever the difference was, had it been over 9 feet, would have come out of the guide's fee. So that's why he was nervous. So he whipped out a tape measure. He said, here's the trick. So he put the edge of the tape measure at the edge of the eye socket and ran the tape out to the end of its nose. So on an alligator, whatever the distance is from the eye socket to the end of the nose in inches is within an inch of what the alligator is in feet. So he measured it, 9 inches right on the bean. He said, this is great. We lugged it back to shore, stretched it out, 8 feet, 11 and a half inches. So anyway, we, that was kind of it. There was a lot more involved in all that, but we hauled it back to his house. He had a big walk-in cooler. It was filled with alligators. At that point, it was just like a Wisconsin deer processor. He said, I'll have the processor show up tomorrow. How do you want the meat packaged? I told him. He said, it'll have your name on it. It'll be in that freezer. Come back anytime you want and pick it up. How do you want the hide tanned? He gave us a catalog. What color do you want? I'll take care of shipping the hide to the tannery. They'll send it to you. Do you want the skull? Oh, absolutely. So I lugged the skull home, the head actually. It didn't turn into a skull until the domestic beetles at the Zoology Museum on campus turned it into a skull. So I had an alligator head in my luggage. I don't know what the TSA people thought of that, but anyway, the skull came out really nice. The meat was fantastic. All kinds of recipes and whatnot that he told us about, or there are plenty of cookbooks on alligator cookery. The hide is just beautiful leather, just spectacular when that finally came back. So all in all, but the best part, when we got the alligator back out on land, he grabbed the head. He said, hey, look at this. Right between the eyes, there was a little triangular divot in the skin. So that was the animal my son had shot between the eyes 3 hours before we ever caught it. The alligator was right there, wasn't fazed in the least by being bonked in the noggin, and ended up succumbing to the beef lung. So anyway, it was a really neat night in the swamp. It was worth every penny we paid for it, and should those of you who hunt want a bit of an experience, I highly recommend alligator hunting. And from the meat standpoint, it was a really popular thing to be able to serve alligator to my friends. So
All right. Thank you.
That's it.
Thank you.
We're done.
Thank you so much. Fabulous. Thanks so much, Scott Craven. And thanks again to all of our sponsors, UW Trout Lake Station, Camp Natural Resources Station, the Lakeland Badger Chapter of Wisconsin Alumni Fund, the Minocqua Public Library, and thanks to one of our big sponsors, the Brittingham Fund of the UW Foundation, and thanks to our host, the Minocqua Brewing Company. And remember, next month is Jason Fischbach on May 3rd, the first Wednesday of May, talking about gardening in the North Woods. If you would like our emails to get reminders, please sign up at the back of the room. And have a great night. We'll see you next month. Thank you very much. Thanks again.
Thanks for coming.